This is the Week on Word, a podcast featuring a roundup of the most interesting, informative, and entertaining interviews from Word Radio. You can listen to WURD Radio anytime, anywhere on wordradio.com and the Word Radio app. Give us a play and download it today. In this episode, Allison Russell, singer-songwriter, musician, and activist, joined Tonya Pendleton on Reality Check to discuss reclaiming folk and Americana music's Black roots, the impact of cultural erasure, and the healing power of musical storytelling. And Michael Steele, former chair of the Republican National Committee and co-host of the new MSNBC show The Weeknight with Symone, Sanders-Townsend, and Alicia Menendez, joined Wake Up With WURD with Solomon Jones to talk about challenging Trumpism. But first, journalist Richard Kreitner joined Evening WURDs with Dr. James Peterson to discuss his new book, Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery.
Welcome to the program, Mr. Richard Kreitner, who is a contributing writer to The Nation and Hudson Valley Magazine, host of an American podcast, Think Back, and author, here to talk about his new book, Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. Richard Kreitner, welcome to Evening WURDs.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for joining. I have so many questions about, first of all, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
I think it opens up the aperture about a discussion that we really need to have about American history, but also about the interface between the Black community and the Jewish community, which I think, and Richard, you tell me if I'm wrong here. It's the first question. I think the historic relationship between American Jews and African Americans is maybe at its most vulnerable that it's been over the course of my lifetime. I just turned 54 on Sunday, but it feels like it's the most vulnerable.
Quick math. Yeah, that sounds about right. Maybe if you were 60 years old, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. Yeah. But, late 60s, I think we're also quite a volatile time, but certainly now would suffice.
Yeah, and so I do want to talk about why that might be the case, but let's dig into the book a little bit. And so, I have an advanced copy, so I'm not exactly sure where this falls, but towards the middle of the book, when you are describing some of the decisions that individual Jewish Americans made to join the Union during the Civil War. You say, you write here that other Jews fought not because they hoped the war would lead to the abolition of slavery, but despite the fact that they feared it would, right? And, and you talk about the Spiegels, which is a family in Ohio in the 1860s. And I wonder if you could, as a way of introducing our audience to your book, can you talk a little bit about some of the decisions that you chronicle historically about Jewish individuals and Jewish families making that it was a very complicated decision to enter into the Civil War. And so to join, like to volunteer of your own volition to join this, which again, just so folks have context here, the Civil War is the most brutal war fought on American soil by far. There are no other wars that even come close in terms of just casualties and destruction. And so signing up for that was an extraordinary decision if you didn't have to. But can you talk a little bit about the kind of complex decision matrix for not just the Spiegels, but for other Jewish families deciding whether or not they were going to join this effort on the side of the Union?
Yeah, certainly. It's an interesting place to start, because there's some things in the book that are specific to the American Jewish experience. Mm-hmm. There are ways in which people either participated in slavery, in the slave economy, or protested and fought against it that were specifically Jewish. There are other ways in which Jews are really not that much different from other white people, and most of them, for the most part, Jews were seen at the time uncomplicatedly as white. So what you're talking about, the dynamic of people joining the Union Army despite the fact that they feared that it might lead to the abolition of slavery, that's very common for a northern white democratic person.
And that fear is based on, help our audience understand what that fear is based on.
Well, depends who you're asking, but, for any kind of lower class white person, or especially an immigrant in the 1850s and 1860s, that's largely going to be based on a fear that the emancipation of African-American enslaved people in the South is going to lead to a mass exodus towards the North and economic competition.
Which is what it did a little while later, but it did do that, right? So
yes, for sure. But that was one reason why an immigrant in the North, Jewish or otherwise, Irish, is likely going to be skeptical of abolitionism and possibly even opposed to the Civil War. And so some Northern whites and immigrants and Jews did hold themselves aloof from the Union Army and tried to avoid the draft once there was a draft starting in 1863. And so Marcus Spiegel is a guy, he left behind just an incredible volume of letters back home to his wife, Caroline, who was raised as a Quaker in Ohio, but met him as a peddler. He was kind of selling goods through the Ohio countryside and converted to Judaism. And they built a life for themselves in rural Ohio. He got into some debt based off some, unfortunate business dealings before the war. And he actually joined the Union Army because there was a rule in Ohio, a law that if you were in the Army, you could not be prosecuted for your debts. You could not be held liable for your debts. So his idea was to get a kind of cushy desk job or some kind of, job in the Army away from the serious bloodshed and action so that he could be immune from his debts and ideally not die. They were young. They were trying to build a family. And that was his goal. And the whole story that I tell in the section about him in the book, and that's very clear in his letters and journals, is that the war itself really begins to change him. His encounters with enslaved people in the South starts to change him, so that by the end of his fighting, because he ends up being killed in action, he's writing letters back home to Caroline, whereas previously he was saying all kinds of, fairly typical for the time, racist gobbledygook. Yep. By the time he dies, he's an out-and-out abolitionist who says that, the war should not end until slavery itself ends. So the war itself had a kind of radicalizing effect on this one man, I think on many Jewish people and on many Americans in general.
Yeah, I wanted to start there deliberately, Richard, because I do want to talk about Judah Benjamin, and I don't know if it's Benjamin or Benjamin and some of the other, they're on a kind of a pro-slavery spectrum, the way you detail the history. I wanted to start with families who decided to sign up for the Union because, one of the things that is complicated about your book, and again, in-depth research here on this particular channel of Civil War history is, there are still a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of sensibility in the Black community about what the Jewish role was in slavery. Right. And if you lead with those who supported the Confederacy, that feeds a certain kind of stereotypical way of or maybe even conspiracy oriented way of thinking about the Jewish overall relation in the transatlantic slave trade. And so I want to make sure that we give some equal time in our brief interview to the political dimensions of Jewish Americans around this particular moment in history. But maybe you could talk a little bit about Judah Benjamin, who was a business person who I guess my interpretation is, I don't know if you can say slightly pro-slavery, but pro-slavery to a point. He did support this piece of returning some enslaved captives in Key West back to the U.S. I'm a little bit more familiar with that history because I've spent time in Key West. People don't know this, but Key West has this very, very rich African and African-American history and Caribbean history there. The Maritime Museum, I think, documents some of these things that cross-pollinate with your work. But can you talk about this other figure who maybe not on the other side, but maybe a little bit more supportive of what the Confederacy was all about at that point in history? Yeah,
certainly. I mean, first, I just want to acknowledge what you just said, that there are a lot of misconceptions out there in the Black community, but not only in the Black community, about the Jewish, role in the slave trade and in slavery. And this was obviously one of the major, very sensitive areas I had to kind of figure out how to deal with in writing the book. And I read a lot of scholarship on the question. Especially there was a huge conversation about it in the 1990s after the release of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews from the Nation of Islam. And, it is, when you dig into it, it is absolutely definitive that Jews did not have a disproportionate role in the Atlantic slave trade or in antebellum slavery in the United States. Just end of story. And a lot of people have kind of left the story there and don't really want to look into the stories of those who were involved. Which was, completely proportionate to the to the role of Jews in overall white American society. I'm interested in those stories. Even if there were two Jewish slave owners or two Jewish slave traders, I would be interested in the stories of how they reconciled or didn't their own tradition of Exodus and of Passover, and a longer history of Jewish suffering and oppression with their participation in the enslavement of others. I'm interested in that story, and it's equally important to not blow out of proportion how responsible Jews were for these massive world historical crimes and sins, and it's equally important to not, brush it under the rug and say, oh, Jews have always been on the side of the oppressed.
I agree with you 100%. Sorry to interrupt you, but I agree with you 100% there. But I just want to clarify a couple of things because again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, Richard, but I talk to conspiracy theorists every day. Okay. I just want to be clear that based on your research, which is in-depth, extensive research, about the role that Jewish Americans and Jewish folks globally played in the transatlantic slave trade, there's nothing out of proportion with the mores and kind of where they were situated in certain nations at that particular point in time. They did not drive the slave trade or start the slave trade or profit the most from the transatlantic slave trade. No,
not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. The best estimate is that Jews, talking about the slave trade, before 1807, that Jews were responsible for about 2% of, slave ships leaving Africa, either owning them or deeply involved in them. And that's completely proportionate with the Jewish share of the overall population.
That's right.
What I say in the book is that's still way too high.
Still terrible. Yep.
And still terrible. And it's still worth knowing the stories of those who were involved.
Absolutely. So, this is what makes the book so powerful too for me, Richard, is that you're not afraid to talk about the Judah Benjamins or the other families and figures who were pro-slavery and engaged in it and with some nuance. But I would love for you to talk a little bit about this particular figure because I think he's one of the more interesting ones in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have one subtitle for the book could be the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm trying to give equal time to all of those.
Right.
And Judah Benjamin he's bad and he's ugly. He was actually a slave owner. He was a plantation owner in Louisiana, and he owns 140 people, or he claimed to own 140 people, making him the largest Jewish slave owner of the time, far from the largest slave owner at the time. People, many, many more. But he was born in the Caribbean, actually, as a British subject. His family moved to Charleston in 1822, right after the Denmark-VC slave rebellion, and he grew up in this very kind of volatile aftermath of that event. He went to Yale as only the second Jewish student there in history. He was expelled under some kind of dubious circumstances, found his way to New Orleans, where he finds that a Jewish person can actually kind of make way and rise in society, unlike Charleston's more kind of cloistered and aristocratic society. He becomes a very talented lawyer. He buys this plantation. I kind of think, he burnt his papers twice, is one thing worth mentioning about him. So we don't really know everything we'd like to know about him. But I think that a lot of signs indicate that he bought this plantation specifically to try to rise in Louisiana's political elite. And that if he was not a slave owner at the time, he would be looked at suspiciously. And he is appointed to the Senate in 1852 and almost immediately sells the plantation. And after that was not a plantation. So there's all these indications through his life that he might be, to some extent, playing a role here. But he is a really vigorous defender of slavery in the Senate, and he ends up becoming the Confederate Secretary of State, Jefferson Davis's right-hand man. And he truly is a fascinating figure. Morally and politically completely horrific and despicable. Personally, he seems to have been a pretty likable guy, unfortunately. He could quote, lots of poems and histories, and he's a real stoic. He's the only leading Confederate who got away, who wasn't arrested, and he survives something like 3 shipwrecks or something, finds his way to London, and has this whole second career as a lawyer. I do think he's on kind of the opposite side of the political spectrum of a Jewish abolitionist. Other people I talked about in the book, a guy named David Einhorn, who's a rabbi in Baltimore,
right?
Of course, in the middle of a slave state, and he very bravely, very heroically, I would say, denounced slavery on the eve of the Civil War, and specifically as a Jew, he's specifically citing the history of Jewish enslavement in Egypt and oppression in Europe in the 19th century to say we can't stand for this. How can we endorse slavery when we ourselves know what it means to be oppressed. And for that, he is run out of Baltimore by a pro-slavery mob and leaves for Philadelphia. And his congregation says, hey, would you please come back once the dust is kind of settled? And they say, but you have to be quiet about slavery. And he utterly refuses to, and he never goes back to Baltimore. So, Benjamin is on one end of a political spectrum.
And Rabbi Einhorn on the other.
Other people I talk about is on the other,
Yeah, and I would just say, Richard, again, I'm not defending Benjamin here, but again, the piece where he does in that critical moment, he supports federal funds to return those enslaved Africans, over 1,000 of them from Key West. I mean, I don't know if that did probably not go through, but he supported that. He showed some signs, like you said, that he knew Jefferson Davis, but he wasn't in complete alignment with Jefferson Davis.
Yeah, they almost fought a duel at one point, shortly before the Civil War. There's some indications that he had a little bit of a heart, that he had a little bit of he quotes Shylock's speech in Merchants of Venice, half nodded Jew eyes, half nodded. He to some extent, somewhere deep down, he seems to have recognized something about common humanity.
Sorry to start in the middle. We should back up a little bit here. A bit of a broader question here, Richard. So, a lot of times when people think about the relationship between African Americans and Jewish Americans, they go right to the Civil War. I mean, right to the Civil Rights Movement. Right. This is the Civil War. Talk a little bit about just how you have to shift your paradigm a little bit in terms of the history of these two communities and the interface between them, in thinking about the Civil War era versus the Civil Rights era.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot. Sometimes people are going to talk about the Civil Rights Movement. They're going to talk about the founding of the NAACP in 1909, where many Jewish Americans were involved. But I think that misses this very crucial first chapter of the story, which is a much more complicated story where, I think you could say that American Jews were disproportionately involved in the Civil Rights Movement, at least early on. You really can't say that about the abolitionist movement. It's a completely different world. It's a completely different society. The Jewish population is much, much smaller. It's around 50,000 in 1850 and 150,000 by a decade later at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. So you're dealing with a much smaller population. American Jewish history in general, people often begin with like 1880, which is the beginning of this mass wave of East European Jews who came over. That's when my own ancestors came over. I didn't have any people here during the Civil War. And it kind of starts around there, and then the Black and Jewish story begins from there as well. But I think that if you wind the clock back another 50 years or something, and you get in a little bit of the existence of the institution of slavery, most importantly, the political struggle over slavery, what different positions did Jews take on that? In what way were they in relation to their Black brothers and sisters at the time? You'd get a much, much more interesting kind of story, and one that I think puts into context a lot of things that happened later, like the founding of the NAACP, the Civil Rights Movement, and then, the faltering of the Black-Jewish alliance later on. I think a lot of Jews over time have kind of thought that we are, together we have suffered the same things throughout history, but in this country that's really not been the case. And of course, there's, I write in the book about this famous James Baldwin essay from 1967, where he's trying to write to his Jewish friends and saying, you act like we have the same history, but it's actually not the case, and you're pretending that it is a little bit of part of the problem. You've never been oppressed in this country the way that we have. And it's an important, part of the story. And then I think an even more important part of the story is, what did Jews say and do when the struggle over slavery was occurring?
Yeah, and your book is absolutely capturing that, and that's why I think it's essential reading for historians of that particular moment. I want to come back into the current moment, though, Richard, because we only got about a minute left. We started this interview by acknowledging that this long history of the African American community and the Jewish American community, storied history, has become quite fragmented and fragile in this particular moment. We could argue that a lot of that has to do with the current war that's going on in Israel and how Black communities have been responding to seeing what they see as a genocide unfolding before their very eyes. But I would argue that it probably goes back a little bit further than October 7th, 2023, in the sense that or 2024, rather, I'm sorry, that it goes back a little bit further than that, because there have been these different flashpoints. Some of them have to do with the rise of anti-Semitism in America. I'm talking about violent anti-Semitism in America. And some of it has to do with some sensitivities within the Black community about being painted with broad brushes as being anti-Semitic. I'm curious, as someone who's taken a look at the history of this relationship, how you see the contemporary moment and the fragility of this historic interface between these two communities.
Yes, big question.
Yeah. Sorry to land here, but this is where we landed, Richard.
Yeah, no, of course. I tend to write these books that are about, that are kind of based off current things that I see, and then I kind of take refuge in the history. And I just, I hope people will read the book and apply it to their own thinking about the day. I'm not sure how much use my kind of opining is on it is. I think that, I think you're right that mutual misunderstandings and, willful misinterpretations are not new. And I think that all efforts should be made to kind of, see what we have in common. And, for my own Jewish community, I think examining our complicity with what's going on in Israel and Gaza is absolutely crucial for repairing our relationship with African Americans here in this country, and for renewing our own tradition as one committed to social justice and equal rights for all.
Wow, that's about as perfect an answer as you can give in 1 minute to that question, Richard. Wow, thank you for that. The book is called Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. It's an in-depth look at the historic origins of the interaction and interface between the Jewish American community and the African American community. Pick it up right now, folks. Richard, thank you so much for doing the work, and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come on Evening WURDs to talk about it.
You're listening to The Week on Word. Stay connected on the go with the new and improved WURD Radio app. Search WURD Radio in your app store. Stream every show with increased clarity, easily access WURD TV, EcoWord, and Livelihood. Remember, Black Media Matters. Get the new and improved WURD Radio app today. Available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. This is The Week on Word, a podcast highlighting the top conversations on WURD Radio. Make sure you look for and follow WURD Radio on social media. Up next, Michael Steele, former chair of the Republican National Committee, joins Solomon Jones on Wake Up With WURD.
Joining us now is Michael Steele. He's an MSNBC co-host. Prior to joining MSNBC, he was elected Lieutenant Governor of Maryland in 2003. Following his time as Lieutenant Governor, he served as chairman of the Republican National Committee from 2009 to 2011. He was the first African-American to hold either office. Michael Steele, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you, Solomon. Hope you're doing well.
I am. I hope you are too. So it's good to have you. So wait, how do you go from being the chair of the Republican National Committee to being on MSNBC, which is a pretty much a left-wing point of view in terms of the network? What was that journey?
Yeah. Well, it's been crazy, man. It's been good fun. Look, when I left the RNC in 2011, I had a chance to go to a number of places. I had, before becoming chairman, been a political analyst at Fox for 2 years. After I left elective office, I went to Fox as a political analyst from 2007 to 2009. Only left there because I had gotten elected chairman of the RNC. So when I came out, my initial thought was, oh, okay, I'll probably go back to Fox. Mm-hmm. But then I just started thinking about it at that time. Barack Obama had been 2 years in office. And I thought it would be, interesting to go into a space where my voice is typically not heard as a conservative, and just kind of go, all right, let me talk to the folks at MSNBC. And in fact, they reached out to me initially about coming on, and I got into the conversation and loved the idea of having a conversation directly with people that I've engaged with politically on different sides of the aisle to talk around big policy differences. And of course, the biggest one at that time was Obamacare. Of course, I led the fight on the RNC side in 2010. Mm-hmm. And now in 2011, Obamacare had become the law of the land, and now we're starting to see its implementation. There were other things that were going on. Recovery was still happening. And so it's a great space to have what I like to have the other conversation, and they were willing to do that. And here I am, 14 years later, still there.
Yeah. And so you're going to be co-hosting the Weeknight with veteran MSNBC host Symone Sanders-Townsend and Alicia Menendez. The three of you will be on that show. And I know you guys have been working together prior to this. How's it been working with the two of them?
It's been amazing, good fun. They're talented, they're smart, gifted journalists and communication experts, and they challenge me, which is what I love. I just love being in a space where I can feed off of that energy and learn different ways to have a conversation. What I love about this show, and especially with what they bring to the table, is, this is a serious moment in American politics. There's no doubt about that. And there are a lot of concerns that people have, but it creates for us every night now to show some positive energy, how people of different political views can actually have a conversation. And while we may all agree right now, with respect to the fight to keep the country from going off the cliff, when we do have those conversations around different policy and political issues, it's an engaging one. It's not antagonistic. It's done with humor. It's done with smart, and they really kind of help create that space, and I love it. It's just been really good to do that on the weekends, and now every weeknight to be able to have those kinds of conversations, to be prepared to talk about the news of the day with humor, with intellect, with insight, I think is a good thing.
So I got to ask you this question, because the Republican president before you became RNC chair was George W. Bush. A completely different kind of president than the current office holder, Donald Trump, who is also a Republican. What do you see as a Black Republican in the change in the party? And is it something that you can support?
No, I don't support it, which is why I've been so antagonistic towards what has happened to the party. I do not appreciate the disintegration of the liberties and freedoms of individuals, regardless of their status. Our Constitution protects everyone, and from birth to death, period. And so the moment you step foot on the soil, even as a visitor, if you're on vacation from Europe and you come here, you're protected by our Constitution. Our police just can't grab you off the streets and take you away. And when we see that happening now, we as citizens have to respond to that. That's not a partisan question. Yeah, it's being done by a Republican president, but it's not a partisan issue. And I think the problem is we fall into that sinkhole of looking at it through that lens. This is a democracy question. This is about how we govern ourselves, whether we value the rule of law, whether our courts matter and their orders are to be followed. And when bad actors with bad behavior do not perform the way we expect them to as citizens because we've elected them, the onus is on us. And so that for me has been the argument I've tried to make since Donald Trump first stepped on the stage in 2015. I warned people then, and I continue to warn them now that, he's smooth and he talks a lot of BS, and he plays to your grievances and your frustrations and your otherism, and he makes you forget why we're American and what that means. And so I stay in the party for two reasons. One, because it pisses them off. And two, because I believe very much in the things that drew me into the party as a young man in the first place, which is why I've always called myself a Lincoln Republican. Right. Because the party, when it was formed, stood about freeing Black men and women, which meant that it stood about holding that Constitution and applying it to them as well. and applying it to everyone, individual rights and freedoms. And so at the core, for me, it's not about, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, whether you're pro-environment, or all of that stuff is add-on.
Yeah.
It's all policy. It's all politics. It's all at the core is, do you have rights? And if you do, which we do under our Constitution, how are they protected? And who's going to do that? Who's going to stand in the breach when the government overreaches or when your rights are violated? And so the party's lost sight of that, to be honest. They've gotten consumed by the thoughts of power and control. They played into their nationalistic tendencies, which is a thread that has run through the party since the 1930s. And there have been leaders inside the party that fought against that. For example, standing up against the John Birch Society in the 1950s. What George Bush did after 9/11, when Republicans started screaming about Muslim this and Muslim that, making it very clear this was not a moment to attack Muslims.
Yeah.
That's not who we were or are. And when that leadership is absent, Solomon, this is what it looks like.
Wow.
And that, my fight now is to sort of remind people of that and engage to course correct as much as possible. I think the party, this last point, I think the party that I led is gone. I'm not delusional on that regard. It will be very difficult to bring it back, if at all. But what still stands are those Lincoln-esque values that helped form us in 1854. And that's what that's my shining light, if you will, that I try to hold up. And whether that lands someplace else in some other form at some other time remains to be seen. But that's where we are right now.
All right. Well, that is Michael Steele. He is a former lieutenant governor of Maryland, also served as chairman of the Republican National Committee from 2009 to 2011, the first African-American to hold either office. And now he is co-host of the Weeknight on MSNBC with co-hosts Symone, Sanders-Townsend, and Alicia Menendez. The show launches Monday, May 5th. It's going to air Mondays from 7 to 9, Tuesday to Friday from 7 to 8.
You're listening to The Week on Word.
Good morning. It's Solomon Jones, host of the hottest morning show on radio, Wake Up With WURD. Listen weekdays from 7 to 10 a.m. for laughter, for fun, for politics, for family, for more than you can imagine. Check it out every day, Monday through Friday. Wake Up With WURD on 96.1 FM, 900 AM, WURD.
You're listening to the Week on Word podcast. To learn more about our programming, simply visit wordradio.com. That's WURDradio.com. Our last conversation for this episode features Allison Russell, singer-songwriter, musician, and activist, conversing with Tonya Pendleton on Reality Check.
They say life imitates art. That's how it happens. Well, we've got a guest here who maybe can tell us whether or not that is the case. Does life imitate art? I think it does. Her name is Allison Russell. She is a Grammy-winning Canadian singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist. I saw her playing a banjo. I was like, wow. And she really is someone who is working in multiple genres, including folk, Americana, blues, and roots music. She won that Grammy for a song called Eve is Black, and it was in the Best American Roots Performance category. So welcome, Allison Russell, to Reality Check. And you're going to be here in Philly on Friday at the TLA performing. So if people don't know roots, Americana, blues, any of that, they can come on out and see it. Now, I want to welcome you to the show and have you explain a little bit about what the genres are that you play in.
Thank you so much. Well, I always say that genre is a construct, much like race, that was meant to extract and exploit and separate people unnecessarily to our detriment. So I think that essentially I am playing in the great, gorgeous melting pot of American musics, which are, of course, a beautiful symbiosis of African influences, of indigenous influences, of course, European influences, Asian influences, everywhere from all over the globe, because we are a melting pot of people from all over the globe. And when I say American, I mean all of the Americas, from the Caribbean to Canada. The full story of that musical migration. The banjo, for example, the oldest banjo that we know of in these continents is the Creole Bania, and that's in Haiti. And it made its way up to Appalachia quite some time after that. So, it is America's African instrument. So there's a lot of reclamation, I think, that's been happening, certainly in the Black diasporic community of the banjo, of folk music, which was sort of branded as white, but folk music just means music of the people, Yeah,
it is really interesting, because when we look at folk, and Philadelphia is a big market for folk, Americana, roots, blues, all those kinds of musics. And in fact, we have the Philadelphia Folk Festival here every year. But I have a feeling when you go to those concerts and you play at those concerts, I would say maybe 95% of the audience is white. How do you deal with that as an artist? And why do you think that persists?
I think it's changing. I definitely see it changing. Like, I just was the keynote speaker at the Folk Alliance International earlier this year, and it was thrilling to get on that stage and see that at least a quarter of the audience were spicy and colorful like me. And that was a huge change from when I started going to that conference 20 years ago with my first baby band, Po Girl, So it is changing. But I think, again, it was by design. If you talk to my sister Rhiannon Giddens, she can give you in-depth knowledge of exactly how and when it. So, if you go way back to the battle days in the enslavement times, all of the musicians on every single plantation were Black. Like, that's who was playing the music. That's who was playing the fiddles and the banjos and everything. After the war and the Reconstruction that didn't really happen, they started to dig their heels into upholding Jim Crow and oppression and inequality, and doing things like banning Black players from fiddle fests, banning Black players from banjo fests, things like that. So, and then there was the horrific domestic terrorism of mass lynchings, things like the Tulsa massacre that forced our diasporic community north. The northern migration wasn't like a pleasure jaunt. It wasn't like, it was because land that was promised was burned and taken and stolen, and communities were violated and bombed and lynched and attacked. And that's domestic terrorism. And it happened. So it's ongoing, as we know, sadly, but it was so severe that the mass majority of Black Americans moved north just to escape that kind of domestic terrorism. And I think when there's like trauma, that kind of deep generational trauma associated with that music, you want to look forward and leave it behind, And I think now there's a reclamation process happening that's really empowering and really joyful. And my sister Rhiannon Giddens really ushered me into that. Like, she formed a group, Songs of Our Native Daughters, with me and Layla McCalla and Amethyst Kia. And that process of reclaiming some songs and finding our stories, especially Black women's stories, hidden in the archive at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, was so powerful and healing and regenerative and generative for me as an artist and a writer. My solo work came out of that experience, being inspired by that experience. So it's ongoing and it's changing. But, and I think we're seeing these huge cultural milestones, like Beyonce's Cowboy Carter winning that Grammy and really pushing to the front. She really did a guide, an auditory guide for people through our presence and our foundational role in all of those genres, on that record. And I think that was incredibly powerful. And it's why she's received so much hateful rhetoric and backlash from a certain segment of the population.
Yeah, I'm glad that you referenced Beyonce, because when you talk about cultural movements, not just Beyonce, you referenced Rhiannon Giddens, and I got to give her props. She is probably the leading Americana roots folk artist who is African-American, and she played on Beyonce's Cowboy Carter and has her own wonderful, amazing career, and has been someone who I know has been a mentor to you and others. And also Sinners, the movie that is out now and making so much money, that is really bringing the blues music to the forefront through this wonderfully talented 20-year-old Miles Caton, who is a big star and sort of the center of this film. So I was shocked to see.
And a little side fun trivia note, Layla McCalla from Our Native Daughters and her sister Sabine have cameos in Sinners, and I'm so proud of them. So,
yay. So I was shocked to know that you have been making music for 20 years, because you look like you are barely 20 yourself.
You are so sweet. I am 45 years old, and I earned every year, and I feel so grateful for every year, because I didn't think I was going to make it past 18.
Did you say 45 years
I'm 45.
Old?
Yes, I'm born in 1979. I'm a 79er.
So when we get off this call, we're going to get all your beauty secrets, okay? I'm going to find out everything that you do, because really, that blew me away. But after doing this for 2 decades, do you feel like now is the right time for this kind of music to have a broader appeal?
I think the fact that you've heard of me and that we're having this conversation at all shows that it does, because I've been doing my same nerdy banjo, clarinet, folky, all Americana girl thing for, as you say, 20 years. And suddenly all of these doors are opening, and suddenly there's Grammy Awards, there's Juno Awards, there's Folk Awards, there's Americana Awards, there's, and it's not that of course, I hope I've always been evolving in my craft and getting better, but I think people are more just simply open to hearing and receiving, and there's so many. You're right that Rhiannon and the Carolina Chocolate Drops 20 years ago at the Black Banjo Gathering that Valerie June also attended started something. They really gave permission to our Black diasporic community to reclaim this music and to celebrate it, and to celebrate how we evolve it. And that it's there hidden in everything, it's there in hip hop. It's there in rock and roll. There's no rock and roll without the blues. There's no blues without the banjo. Keith Richards plays a 5-string guitar because he was imitating Delta banjo bluesmen that he was inspired by. He wrote about that in his autobiography. I was so blown away by that when I read that. And I love that he acknowledges it, because there's a lot of American white artists here who don't acknowledge that, folks like Jason Aldean using trap beats in their music and then making racist songs and statements. It's just ridiculous. They're just, you have to be able to acknowledge what you are borrowing from, otherwise it's stealing, right? So
there you go. Well, we can experience your music live Friday, May 2nd, Theater of the Living Arts, 7:30 p.m. I got to ask you though, before I let you go, Wendy and Lisa played on Eve Was Black. And I'm told that's at your tiny desk 2 years ago that you did for NPR Music, that you put a picture of Prince up and Joni Mitchell. So if you love Prince, we're friends. But how did Wendy and Lisa get on this Grammy-winning song?
So you know what? They're all over my whole last record, The Returner. And it happened through my dear brother, Joe Henry, who's a beautiful producer. He produced a record for Betty Lavette a couple of years ago that won her finally a Grammy that was so long overdue. He produced a record for the Carolina Chocolate Drops as well, Rhiannon's band before her solo work, called the Genuine Negro Jig album that won the 2010 Grammy Award for Best Folk Album. And Rhiannon introduced me to Joe. Joe produced an album for one of my earlier projects called Birds of Chicago. And he's become a mentor and a friend. And he's very close with Lisa Coleman from Wendy and Lisa, and Wendy too. But we dreamt of having Lisa play keys on this one song on The Returner. And we emailed Joe and we're like, what do you think? Would you be comfortable connecting us? He's like, I will email her. I'll send her these demos. And she loved the demos. So she started texting my partner and co-producer, JT Nero's phone. And he called me freaking out. He's like, Wendy's sending me heart emojis. I'm like, Wendy and Lisa. And they said yes to playing on the record if we could come to them. They were like, we can't come to, originally we were going to do it in Nashville. And they said, if you can come to LA and do it here at Henson Studio, where they've had their own studio for 16 years, where they're doing their Wendy and Lisa work, their incredible score work that they do for film and TV, all the brilliant, they're just endlessly brilliant, expansive composers, artists, writers, singers, collaborators. They're just so brilliant. And of course we said yes. And we had 6 days where all aligned. It happened to be the winter solstice of December 2022. It was so like witchy and beautiful. And it was 16 women with our big sisters, Wendy and Alicia, at the helm. And we recorded that whole record in those 6 days. And by the end of it, we were family. We still have a thread that we call Volvatron. That was like, this isn't Voltron, it's Volvatron.
That's
so we have this
funny.
Voltron thread. And all these other cross-pollinations have come out of it, like Sister Strings played on a Wendy and Lisa score that they were working on. Larissa Maestro wrote a string arrangement for the new Annie Lennox, Wendy and Lisa album that's coming. Y'all, do you know about this?
No.
It's coming. I'm not saying anything I shouldn't, because they talked about it in Variety magazine.
Okay.
So it's coming, and we got to hear 5 rough mixes in the studio when Annie laid down her Super Lover vocals, and it was, I cannot wait. Y'all are going to, the world will be changed. Like They have lost any of their genius, any of their power, any of their grit. It's all there.
That's awesome. And of course, Annie Lennox, who did her first vocals with you in 7 years, is on your song, Super Lover, that is out now. And Eve is Black, Wendy and Lisa, essential elements of Prince's band, The Revolution, are on the song Eve is Black. Eve was Black, that won you a Grammy. Congratulations on that. Right. I see it behind you. Yes. Congrats on that. Absolutely. Well, Allison, I have so enjoyed talking to you. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end, but I want to send everybody to your show, which is Friday, May 2nd. Theater of the Living Arts. That's the TLA down on South Street, 7:30 p.m. And maybe we will be able to send some folks there to the show. We'll check in and see if we can do that. We'd love to have some folks come out and check out Americana roots and the music that may not be what we all are so used to, but is really producing some new stars. Like, well, not new, but overnight success takes time, right?
That takes 20 years every time.
Yeah, there you go. Allison Russell, absolutely great talking to you, and really continue doing what you're doing, because we need to be able to be present in more than just the genres that we know and love. We love those for a reason, but there are so many other different sides to our talent and our music, which you are aptly showing in the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on the show.
This is the Week on Word. Represent your favorite station in style. Look for Afrocentric tees, hoodies, tumblers, notebooks, mugs, and more. Just click the Shop tab at wordradio.com. Show the world that you're all about Black Talk Media.
You gotta look good.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Week on Word. Let's stay connected. Sign up for our newsletter and listen to us online at WURDradio.com and on the Word Radio app.